Of interest are his uses of color and nature to offset human deficiencies. I am of course reminded of Dali's 50 Secrets of Magic Craftsmanship, in which he admits his quote-unquote secrets or occult mastering of painting in the same fashion from his trilogy, at least what I'm calling his trilogy: The Secret Life of Salvador Dali, Diary of a Genius, and of course Rostros Ocultos, which of course becomes Hidden Faces. Ironically, it was in his only novel, true novel in terms of a nouvelle form, Rostros Ocultos, that Dali speaks to his formidable and collective skill set. In quoting, "Sooner or later, everyone is bound to come to me. Some, untouched by my painting, concede that I draw like Leonardo. Still others have discovered in me literary gifts superior to the skill which I reveal in my pictures. Of these who think this, Lorca is chief. Thus it is difficult to avoid coming under my sway in one way or another. Yet all this has much less merit than it seems to have, for one of the chief reasons for my success is even simpler than that of my multiform magic, namely that I am probably the most hard-working artist of our day." This, of course, was taken from the author's foreword in Rostros Ocultos. Dali followed up such a bold statement with what I hope to unpack as the initial velocity of his creative persona, his status not as an artist, not painter, not sculptor, not poet, not esotericist, not author, not critic, not writer, and certainly not film director/stager. He is not one of these things, but all of these things, because Dali is a demiurge and a dialectician. From the Greek demiurgus, that wordplay, we arrive at creator in the Protean sense of the word, in the use of materialism in a post-neo-Aristotelian notion. This is further given traction as Dali, creator demiurge, asserts how many characters, quote, images, architectural projects, and realizations of desires had been born, lived, died, and been resuscitated, architectonized. My talk this evening held a different title. It was Or Dali as Creator versus Dali's penetration, shame as acrosomal reaction to the membrane. However, it has been distilled, like I said, to Dali as creator demiurge. What follows is a series of evidences of the demiurge's vast appetite for creativity as well as his connectivity, beginning with himself as its chief sperm head. Correct. Chief sperm head. But first, a question. What in the world is acrosomal reaction? As you look at this particular image, I'll briefly distill this in the simplest form and of course use this as an analogic to Dali and how he affects you and I. So in a clinical sense, during fertilization, a sperm must first fuse with the plasma membrane and then penetrate the female egg in order to fertilize it. This particular egg is called an ovum or an oocyte. Fusing the egg usually causes little problem, whereas penetrating through the egg's hard shell can present more of a problem to the sperm head. Therefore, sperm cells go through a process known as the acrosome reaction. This particular acrosome reaction that occurs in the acrosomal head of the sperm happens as the sperm head approaches that given egg. The acrosome is a cap-like structure over the anterior half of the sperm's head. As the sperm approaches the zona pellucida of the egg, a fancy way of calling it the outer wall, the peptidoglycan wall of the animal cell, in that sense, of course, being the ovum. The contents include surface antigens when that acrosomal reaction takes effect, and numerous enzymes which, of course, are responsible for breaking through the egg's tough coating and allowing the ultimate or inevitable end, fertilization. When we approach Dali, then, it is under my humble but yet firm belief that it is with this level of acrosomal interaction, that is to suggest, folks, at times when Dali encounters the ovum or the outside membrane of our minds, as he's fissuring through as the sperm head into our psyches, as it were, we have elation, disgust, awe, shocked, and often, yes, very often, quizzical. This is the enactment of that surface to surface, of Dali's sperm head maneuvering into our oocyte minds, as it were. The results, I think, are astounding, as this talk will hopefully showcase. In looking at this particular image, notwithstanding, again, this injection happens, literally. This moment, this right here becomes that acrosomal reaction. So the sperm head can be pictured as Dali, while this outer wall pictured as our resistance. Not wanting, for instance, an infusion of Dalianism, as it were. However, the problem with that is that the acrosomal reaction from Dali is way too strong. It's way too powerful. The force itself allows for this interaction, and an acrosomal reaction does in fact take effect. I'm of the strong opinion that because Dali is creating demiurge or demiurge, that he actually presents us with the possibility of infinite, as him being creator allows us to create level of creativity. Quotes come to mind, one from Marcel Proust, said that the highest praise of God consists in the denial of him by the atheist, who finds creation so perfect that he can. The second quote caught my attention, of course, because Dali references and invokes him in the author's note to his Rostros Ocultos. Nature is full of infinite causes, birth and experience. Collectively, this is the formula. Dali, as the sperm head, plus our ovum minds, literally equals this breaking out. Atmosphere. Tension involved. You see there's a world view involved. Now, without diving into too much depth in terms of what the egg, blood, these kinds of secretions held for Dali, in a simple frame, you can see, image-wise, what the summation and the possibilities are. Well, how did I get involved with Dali proper? That is to suggest, how did Dali come to me? This happened back in high school. It was about 1992-93. Sorry to date myself a little bit. And I went to a private school called Country Day, and the art teacher there was talking about surrealism as a political movement, and I was interested at the time to politics and what have you. And the teacher showed us a documentary, black and white, of a man with a funny mustache. Quirky, always twitching every 4 or 5 minutes. The very fact that I could read the twitch, the tell sign within 4 to 5 minutes also spoke highly of my own twitchiness, if you will. And I realized that he had something in his hands. But what he had in his hands was a piece of foil. Dialoguing with the cameraman. As I was doing this back and forth, it dawned on me that he's forming something. He's shaping something. He's creating something. Not just merely by his own words, but Dali is creating with his hands. And so from the very beginning, I understood that what we have here, in this kind of embodied space, this kind of materialism, the man who does not know how to shut it off. That is to suggest a demiurge, demiurgus, is a protean figure. It creates constantly. They don't know what off switch is. Doesn't make sense to them. And so Dali, in speaking and engaging, I should mention, he had flowers in his ears. He had flowers in his mustache. So he was a walking event, which caught my attention as a high school student. And then, of course, this really got to me where he brought up the piece of foil And folks, I kid you not, he put it right next to his face, and it was as if it was an embossed image of himself who had done this. Yet he had never put the piece of foil up to his face. I was absolutely struck with that idea. And so I continued my academic progress and my interests with that kind of planted, fertilized bug, as it were. So at that point, the demiurge had actually impregnated my mind, and I would never lose sight of this particular character or his caricature in this persona, Dali. Well, he invited me, and I took this as a personal invite, but he invited me from one of his anecdotes that I had come across in my research here. And the anecdote goes back to himself as being the ontic pharmacon. That is to suggest that he is the drug. And many of us have heard this story, have heard this shared tale. You may not have heard this version of it. So apparently he's in NYC, that is New York City, Dali is, and he's in the back of a taxi car. And the man who's driving the taxi realizes who he has behind him. So of course, he's of interest, and he wants to show off. So he asks Dali if he would like to know anything, and if he could be of any service. And in fact, it goes all the way on to, by the way, I have drugs. Would you like to take some? And of course, clearly the taxi man didn't have a clue who really was in the back seat, because the response from Dali, this later on became a more of a formal response. This is back in 1970. The response is this, and this is the invitation that got me started. Take me, I am the drug. Take me, I am hallucinogenic. That coming from the hallucinogenic Dali. Now, going back to the actual anecdote, the story, Dali was absolutely furious, absolutely offended. How can you offer me drug? Do you know who I am? I am the drug, right? Now that's one way of reading that tale. As a demiurge, the way he's describing himself in that instance, he's saying, why bother taking anything else that adds nothing? I take myself because my own person, my entity, is always on, which means I'm always creating. But where do I look for inspiration? Me. Myself. I consume, ingest me, Dali. Now, this is of high interest because this brings us back to this idea of what does that offer for us? What does that offer for you and I, right? If we're supportive of Dali in some form or fashion, either we're elated or disgusted, shocked or embracing. It doesn't matter, because Dali as demiurge always penetrate. Adults being such things as the beauty DNA molecule. No, high praise that Dali was absolutely involved with DNA and the ideas of DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, the idea of a sugar phosphate backbone, the idea of a double helix form, perfect, because it maintains literally designs for you and I. What actually inculcates you to be you and me to be me. In fact, it made big news, not just because of the Watson-Crick model, which of course all these subsequent models have taken effect, but because in 2000, if you recall, in a Times magazine on the front cover, one really, hippie yet turned scientist, and the other being part of the National Science Foundation head, well on his way, he thought, for a Nobel Prize, had mapped out the human genome. That is to suggest that there are no codons about you that we don't have access or know about. So exactly what turns you on. That should scare you. But at the same time, that should release you. And yet, this is what Dali is working with and from back then. He's actually talking about this in a freeing mind, freeing landscape of the very simple design, which, by the way, is separated only to be reproduced. What is the idea of butterfly and the idea of metamorphosis? The very fact that we get a chance to look at this example, the others like it. Now Dali, like I said before, penetrates, he shocks, inculcates us, right? He impregnates our minds. There's very little thing we can do to that kind of assault. us to really remember the connectivity, right, that we missed here. Kind of fissuring between these two, but the connectivity that we have in the very person of a very Mobian strip sort of way. Philosophy, this idea of an unending parallel loop, as it were. We call that, well, by time and space mentioned, we call it what? Eternity. Infinity. For Dali, this would be represented as immortality. So the multiplicity of Dali, he already has one of the biggest, largest, most infuriating egos and arrogance and hubris, but this is beyond just merely that. This is beyond just that. So we have such images like this. He's telling us, I am the ocular proof. I am the ocular proof. Remember, take me. I am the drug. Not only goes through several layers. Very suggestion, and this again aligns itself with my subtext of my book, the idea of la brujeria de las mujeres, suggesting that women as bewitching agents can actually be used as multiplicitous form. Because not only do we get into this idea of we don't understand, we being, masculinity, manhood, and so forth. That's beyond this. By the time we get into this kind of scene, we're more impressed with the natural order of things. We have this kind of fetal mentality. Of an ant. Not to mention this out in the heavens. So that there's a very famous surrealist image of the lobster with the claws as the receiver end of a telephone. And all that's very interesting. And now it's very difficult once you've captured that moment to now see a phone of that type the same. And that's one of the offshoots that Dali happens to do. Not only changes the way that particular object, but you will never stop to change that particular object. That's part of the demiurge. That's part of the demiurge. That's part of Dali. Dali, very erotic. By distinction, next set of slides are very erotic by nature, but I want us to move beyond the very idea of sexuality, because for Dali, this didn't present itself much of a remember the title. Not recognizing that person's face. So that grab you are literally that's not what should grab you. On second, third glance. Dali was absolutely not to be outdone, and by the time we're finished with some of these slides, I'm sure we'll sense that. The idea, of course, is remember the formula. This particular image makes another appearance. Because when you start the things that Dali was always stretching and pushing beyond the boundaries were beyond our labels. That is, that idea of sadism, for the Marquis de Sade, for instance, or masochism. And going beyond this, Dali pressed and pushed forward the ideas of clitorism. And this, of course, is coming from the protagonist of his book. For those of you familiar with Hidden Faces, the protagonist of that book, the name is Solange de Clédat. And so that particular protagonist, he framed the existence of something called clitorism. So clitorism is beyond the mere symbols of sadism, beyond these masochistic ideas, that is the object taking upon themselves to enjoy such pleasure or act. And he's going beyond this in towards of a transcendent body image. And this, so in essence, and this is again, pleasure and pain are all sublimated, all transcending identification. So beyond looking at this as the woman that's auto-sodomized, the transcendent quality is that as you're seeing these kinds of rhino horns, where these are structurally positioned, like in this particular image, this is nothing more than a drooping clock, and then of course this is a piece of bread. However, the piece of bread, we clearly see that it also elongates, pun intended, elongates into the shaft and the helmet of the male genitalia. Side by side, we can see how this also adds to how that becomes a more of a sublimated, transcendent. So, even though these things were not drawn, or at least envisioned side by side, you can see how they have this kind of connectivity, not just merely by theme. They're absolutely octopus tentacled simply because Dali's a demiurge. Remember, this idea comes from not art in this sense, craft as a writer. I want to stress that idea that this is from his literature. In a sort of deconstructed sort of way, Dali's focus and somehow obsession with Allah. My talk in December will talk a little bit more about that, more specifically on those issues. What we should take away from this idea, this angle, is also have the title of Dala and Dali. They are one and the same. Not necessarily just superimposed, but this idea of transcendent quality back and forth. In fact, if memory serves, the idea of Dali was Allah were the preeminent. Had other. As it were. Now, again, beyond just arrogance and hubris, this idea makes absolute sense in the ideas of a demiurge. It absolutely makes sense because creators have substance like this, and their offspring is what they hope their legacy will kind of infuse, as it were. So we have this image. Now, I've been kind of talking about, on some hand, the ideas of secrecy and his mysterious ways, perhaps, and even his occult kind of nature. It begs the idea that we should really be careful and cautious about what we mean by this idea of the occult. Well, first off, what is the occult? It's more than anything that goes bump in the night. We need to move beyond these cursory, kind of like pedantic measures of what the occult happens to be. In fact, the occult is all of these things. So that is that which is hidden, that which is secret, i.e., that is unknown, that is which is not easily explained, or what we call inexplicable. That which relates to, now this is a bit more specific, but relates to the ideas of magic, alchemy, pre-chemistry, as it were, astrology, theosophy, other practical arts, right, for the sole purpose of secrecy and holding a mysterious nature. That which is communicated only to the initiated. Now, this is very important because otherwise Dali remains an enigma. And if I'm not mistaken, one or two of you I had the pleasure of speaking with earlier this evening, and that was your word choice to describe Dali. That's because he's a demiurge. That's absolute creator. That's our biggest problem with Dali. What is he? What can we say of this particular man and what he's created? Why do I have so much trouble understanding art? That's because Dali was 30, 40 moves ahead. But the point of a chess master is that Dali is a chess master in all these things. So if anybody questions the genius, I can understand it. Move the mind. Not just mere disgust, but revisit. Because in many cases, as we'll change that channel. The news is terrible. Now, I'm not pointing fingers. Dali moving beyond just the compartmentalization. This is Dali as demiurge. Okay. As an intermission, what I wanted to show you folks is That's what's happening with Dali, in a sense. And so, of course, if I may, that particular image, I mean, again, Oceananu is absolutely replete with Dalianism. And simply, of course, it's his demiurgic state at his fullest, using the medium of film, collaborating with, of course, Luis Buñuel. He did partner, of course, with Disney, and, of course, the production, even though it was in 1945, there's the latest one, I think, in 2000. Of course, Destino, we won't get a chance to look at it tonight, but Destino, of course, if you haven't seen it, in a simple, gross simplification, is of Ganarai, the beacon at the head of Chronos, right? So think of the god of time, in line, of course, the idea is temple. Mythology, the Greek. Well, this is your mind on Dali. No image would satisfy this kind of breadth of our encounters with Dali. And so this is it. Literally the synaptic clefts of your brains, right? Your collective brains are all firing. Technicolor. So it's good to picture that every time you come to Dali, you come with this viewpoint in mind. Rarely will you ever come to Dali in a black or white monochromatic setting. That's because the demiurge will not easy to call him just merely initiated. Also, how Dali misread himself. It's very difficult to do. Some of the things to keep in mind going forward is we're all historical and politically driven. And I won't spend too much time on this, but this really should the focal point, those of you who are really intrigued or Dali, the demiurge, from a psychopathological that drive, of course, is coming from Freud, and I would say that Dali is more Jungian than Freudian. Just in my excavation of his work. This information, and it's really for more your sake, but again, this idea of timeline, alchemy, this idea of syncretism, That's the buzzword for the night. What do we call something that kind of borrows from here, borrows from there, borrows from back in terms of discipline, multidisciplined, or the syncretic spell? Get this idea of syncretism. That should be put together side by side as this kind of explosion. Right? This is what's coming. Because Dali literally is and he's using, of course, himself to do it. Some of the things that he's done, of course, is this idea of the angel of alchemy, right? Which is very intriguing. Of course, gold being overlaid, and this again, this kind of helical structure you can see, start feature, and it spirals all the way back out. Not only on par with this idea of DNA, of course, as you saw, spiraling out with the back archangel, perhaps. And there's more than just this kind of image. There's the fabric right there. But archetypes in the mythology of Dali. And how we understand. This is a really interesting kind of image because it does have, again, talk about syncretism, just on a very cursory level. There's a Greek version of the Phoenix, also an Egyptian version of the Phoenix myth. In both cases, there is a death, life, and resurrection morality assigned to these kinds of myths. And their rebirthing effect, suggesting for Dali that once again, we have this idea of the tree of life, and it's very interesting that even though these colors that you would expect in a given tree, more interesting is, again, this intertwine that reflects two things. One, on one level, the medicinal signs, right? Makes that connection. The idea of the DNA helix all over again. Absolutely focused on this idea of a progeny and so forth. And without further ado, the idea of king and queen, with the idea of, now this is coming incidentally from a tarot. I had the pleasure of this past summer somewhere in the line, Dali. Now we get to the rhizome. Before I jump into this, just to open up with a final kind of question. How then, after looking at all this information, after being bombarded acrosomally by the stimulus involving Dali, how then are we to approach such a vast and what I call a protuberant mind and creative genius? In simple answer, I offer, we must simply enter de-territorially. That is to suggest the rhizome as a genesis point or a launching pad. Well, what is the rhizome? Well, I became a Dali research fellow working on my second manuscript, the Dali's Medievalism text, simply because I thought that Dali moved in more fields and in more space than was allotted the mere artist. And because of that, I got a hold of two French thinkers by the names of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. And their text, of course, is 1,000 Plateaus. The first of three texts that frame the trilogy between capitalism and schizophrenia. And in that opening introductory nod to the first book called 1,000 Plateaus, I came across the term rhizome. And the rhizome, in its simplest form, can be discussed as follows. And again, for our purposes and designs, the rhizome is an evolving term that stems from the theories of, again, Deleuze and Guattari. It has been offered as an explanatory framework for network theory and hypertext. Their rhizome is not non-hierarchical, it's not heterogeneous, it's not multiplicitous and only a-centered. The term can be applied broadly, as Deleuze and Guattari intended, I think, and as a framework to the new world or the neo-world that Dali calls forth. The word rhizome originates in botany, in the biological roots. It's organized by the Oxford English Dictionary as a prostrate, quote, or subterranean root-like stem emitting roots and usually producing leaves at its apex. Further, it's a root stock. So, clearly, we're not dealing with something that's just root-based. Dealing with something that is absolutely in every single one of these kinds of break-offs is imagine Dali's thinking along these lines, not having necessarily a beginning, but always existing in the on switch in the middle. You have to actually look for an end to it. It actually fosters not just mere creativity. And if you question where it should have started or where it began, being part of that middle row is just another middle that needs to go back yet more. This actually fosters itself creatively in multiple disciplines. As a person who teaches at USFSP, I promise I use this in my professional and technical and business communication classes from the writing side of things, but I also use it into my classes like the literature and occult course. I use it in other literary programs such as BritLit, and on great survey narratives and so forth. And these particular classes allow me the opportunities. I gave a class the other semester on monster theory, where I was looking at the politics of, again, moving beyond the cursory knowledge of just mere zombies and vampires. I mean, come on, right? Let's move beyond this. What are monsters by today's standards? Well, by definition, they're things that are monstrum from the Latin, the idea of they're always on display. They're hard to miss. They're always there, which means that they're always on. That would suggest to us tonight that Dali, in that particular framing of a rhizome and this idea of a monstrum, is the chief architectonic of a monster. He's an absolute monstrosity that unfortunately is plagued by today's standards with negative associations. It's unfortunate because we mock what we don't understand. And when we start to finally uncover some layers, not just for Dali, even though it's focused, well placed on him, I think we'll discover the level of creativity, the bubbling factors underneath. that allow our minds to kind of really explode and to be that kind of multicolor synaptic image that we saw before. I'd like to say thank you for my talk. Any particular questions or comments I leave open to the audience. One final parting nod that I have that's reflective of Dali is that in his Diary of a Genius, I've replaced the word readers for audiences. I've kind of recoined, and I will say now I've plagiarized his statement. So I take it as my own, but I do mean it in the same kind of emphatic mallet on your toe of the mind kind of thing. So I say, audience, look at my illustrations and remember that all cosmogonies are born in this way. Thank you very much.